Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for Eden's Promise Litany Savage. This is the second Savage raid made available by patch 5.4 in Final Fantasy XIV, Futures Rewritten. My name is Mystech and I'll be your raid guide. Deep Shadow Nova will deal high raid-wide damage, mitigate shield and heal as necessary. When the boss casts Implosion, you'll see him either rear up his head or lift his tail, indicating an attack is coming from in front or behind respectively. At the same time, a shadow will be cast in a random direction. The tricky part here is that players will need to expect the attack to come out in the same orientation as the shadow, not the original position of the boss. This can be incredibly confusing at first, so make sure you keep practicing until your brain understands it. Next up, the boss will stand up. He'll deal a massive point-blank AoE that deals damage and debuffs players with damage down. Anytime you see the boss raise up on his hind legs, make sure you move away immediately. When the boss casts Giga Slash, he'll hold up his sword in either his right or left hand, signaling a massive right or left attack is incoming. Naturally, a shadow will spawn in a random orientation around him, and players will again need to quickly identify the safe side based on the shadow instead of the boss. Look at the boss to see which side is safe, and then apply that to the shadow itself to properly dodge the attack. Next up, Umbra Smash will target the primary target with 4 heavy-hitting slashes that also apply slashing resist down and magic vulnerability up debuffs. Immediately after, the boss will cast either Shadow's Edge, which is a massive line tank buster, or Darkness Unleashed, a massive circle buster that needs to be shared with the group. To handle this, the primary target will need to pop heavy cooldowns or immunities to handle all 4 slashes. As soon as the 4th slash applies, the second tank can provoke and be ready to take either incoming tank buster with more cooldowns. If Shadow's Edge is casting, the tank will face the attack away from others. If Darkness Unleashed is casting, the tank will need to move in and stack with the rest of the group to share the damage. The previous tank will still be debuffed at this time. They'll need to make sure to stay away from either attack. The boss will then cast Shadow Cleave, and at the end of the cast, all players will be hit by an 8-point cleave dealing moderate damage. Each player will need to spread to an assigned clock position to avoid overlap. At the same time, a shadow clone of the player will spawn in the exact orientation of the player at the end of the cast, and be linked to them by these very obvious pink and black tethers. The boss will then cast Dual Spell, marking up a player for stack up damage that will blast a total of 3 times. At the same time, the clones will begin to telegraph a specific number over their head. These numbers appear one at a time, and you'll notice 2 clones get marked with number 1 first, then another 2 clones marked with number 2, and another 2 clones finally marked with number 3. The last 2 clones will receive no number. These numbers indicate at which point during the stack up damage cycle each clone and thus player are marked with an extra magic vulnerability up debuff, indicating that they cannot stack with the group for that particular blast. To handle this, we have all players stack inside the boss's hitbox. Players with no numbers are safe to stack for all 3 blasts and never have to move. The numbered players will need to pay attention to their clone numbers and move in or out of the blast to avoid sharing damage when they're not able to do so. Players marked number 1 will need to immediately move out of the stack to avoid that first hit. As soon as the blast goes off, they can move back in and stack for the rest of the attack. Players marked number 2 can take the first blast, but then immediately move out before the second blast before moving back in for the final blast share. Players marked number 3 can take the first 2 blasts, but then must immediately move out to avoid the third and final blast. Once all 3 shared blasts go off, the boss will cast Shadowkeeper, and all clones will teleport directly behind their players. Moments after, they will all cast a large frontal cleave in front of them. To avoid getting slammed by a clone, we have players bait their clones in specific areas before moving away to avoid each cleave. The clones will disappear after their cleave attacks. Next up, another Umbra Smash tank buster. Tank swap after the 4 slashes and then be ready to stay away or stack up for the second buster. Don't forget those cooldowns. The boss will then cast Shadow Servant, and either all tanks and healers or all damage dealers will be linked to the boss with these black shadow lines. These 4 players will have their shadows seized, and then the boss will cast Giga Slash. Now for the tricky part. Players will first have to identify if the Giga Slash is coming from the right or the left. Then players with seized shadows will have to stand around the boss at the cardinal, which positions their shadow with the unsafe side to the outside, forming a safe zone on the boss. This is an incredibly confusing mechanic until you practice it a lot, so don't get discouraged. Since I'm a visual person, I like to position my camera directly behind the boss so I can quickly discern if the left or right side is unsafe. Then I quickly apply that same image to my shadow from behind, or where its head is, to determine which way it should be facing. Then I move to the side of the boss that will allow me to point the unsafe side of my shadow outwards. It may take some trial and error to find out the best way that your brain processes this information fast enough to move into position to avoid cleaving your raid, so keep up the practice and don't get discouraged when you make mistakes. Just before the Giga Slash goes off, each shadow player will be locked in place for a few seconds. As soon as they can move, they'll need to move into the boss with the rest of the group to avoid the shadow attacks. Next, the other role group will have their shadows seized, and the boss will cast another Giga Slash. These players will move their shadows to the appropriate sides and then move in to avoid the Giga Slash attacks in the same manner. After a short while, while, the boss will lose his sword and come back down on all fours. Anytime he does this, players need to expect a knockback and raid-wide damage. As soon as the sword disappears, players can use a knockback immunity. Next up, Umbral orbs will spawn 4 sets of orbs, 2 solo purple orbs, and 2 sets of 3 orange orbs at the cardinal points around the platform. Shortly after they spawn, these orbs will slam into the closest players to them, dealing high damage. The purple orbs must be taken alone by each tank, while each orange clump of orbs should be shared by the raid split in 2. Since these orbs can spawn in any orientation, we have starting points for each group that will adjust based on which orbs spawn where. Quickly move into position to soak each orb as necessary. When the boss casts Spawn Shadow, 4 clones will appear around the room. One will be tethered to the boss as Shadow Warrior begins to cast. Players will need to identify this tethered clone and follow it around the room as it jumps. Each ad will jump around 5 times and can double back, so don't lose track of the one that started with the shadow tether. This ad will then deal a massive frontal attack that players can only dodge by being right against the side that it has jumped to. While all of this jumping around is happening, the boss is also casting Umbral orbs. These orbs will spawn in a line diagonal through the center of the platform. As players move to the safe edge to avoid the clone attack, they will also need to line up in front of these orbs to soak them appropriately. To handle this and avoid confusion, we use relative assignments against the safe wall. The 2 tanks will be assigned to either the leftmost or rightmost purple orb, while the 2 split raid groups will also be assigned to either the leftmost or rightmost orange orbs, regardless of which orientation they spawn in. As long as each player lines up correctly on the safe side directly in line with their orbs, all orb soaks will resolve as necessary. Another deep shadow nova to heal through, and then the boss will cast Fade to Shadow. 4 tethered shadow puddles will appear in each corner of the platform. The puddles with the straight tethers will explode in large AoE circles first, while the puddles with the squiggly tethers will explode after. At the same time, the boss will cast another Implosion with his shadow up. To handle this, players can first position themselves in line with one of the squiggly tethers. Once Implosion begins to cast, players will need to find the safe spot, which will always be one of the 2 squiggly tethers. Adjust to the safe side if necessary. Implosion and the first set of circle explosions will occur at roughly the same time. As soon as they do, players can then rotate to avoid the second round of circle explosions. This is immediately followed by another Deep Shadow Nova, so healers be ready with those shields and heals. Next up, the boss will cast 4 Implosions in a row with a shadow spawn each time in a random order. Players need to quickly identify which side of each shadow is safe and move for all 4 attacks in quick succession. Again, this is followed by yet another Deep Shadow Nova to heal through. Eventually, the boss will stand back up and all players will need to move away to avoid the point blank AoE attack. This is followed by another tank buster to swap for and heal through. Next up, VOIDGATE will spawn 4 meteor circles around the center that require 2 players each to soak. Standing in these circles also afflict players with bleed debuffs, so to save healers a bit, you don't need to move in them right away. To eventually handle this, we loosely assign each circle to 2 players. The boss will then cast another Shadow Servant, and 1 role group will be marked for Shadow Seizure again. The players unaffected can stay in their assigned meteor circles, while the shadow players need to quickly identify which side the Giga Slash is coming from, and position themselves inside of the meteor circle on the side that will force their shadows to attack outwards. The towers are soaked about the time that the shadow players are bound in place, and then all players can move into the center to avoid the Giga Slashes. At the same time, the next round of meteor circles will appear at the intercardinals, and we have everyone rotate clockwise from their first meteor circle into the new set. The next round of shadow seizures will occur on the other role group, and they too will need to quickly identify the incoming Giga Slash. Once the intercardinal meteor circles are soaked, they'll need to immediately move to their respective safe sides to position their shadows to attack outwards. Remember to move in to avoid the Giga Slashes. Next up, Pitch Bog will target all players with these large dark circles that will deal high damage and debuff players at the end of the cast, leaving behind large puddles that persist for some time. If a player steps into one of these puddles, they'll spawn a shadow clone, so be sure to drop these out of the way for now. Next up, Umbral orbs will again spawn at each corner of the room. Before they go off, the boss will return to all 4s, signaling a knockback. Since players want to be careful not to get knocked into any of the Pitch Bog puddles or out of positions to soak their appropriate orb, they'll need to use a knockback immunity once the boss's sword disappears. As they do this, they'll rotate into position to soak the appropriate Umbral orbs. Next up, another 2 implosions with shadows to dodge. Find the safe spot and dodge both shadow attacks in succession. Around this time, the Pitch Bog puddles will also disappear. You'll need to heal through another Deep Shadow Nova before the boss casts Shackled Apart. The tanks and healers will each be tethered to a damage dealer, and these 2 role groups will need to stay apart from each other or they'll take high damage and debuffs. Fade to Shadow is next while players are still shackled. Each group will need to stand on opposite squiggly lines to dodge the first circle explosion. While this is happening, Umbral orbs will again spawn at the cardinal edges. Once the first set of circle explosions go off, all players can rotate into the next safe zone for the second set of explosions. Immediately after, players will need to move into position to soak the Umbral orbs. There is very little time to get positioned here, so all players will need to know in advance which direction they're rotating as soon as the Umbral orbs spawn. To facilitate this, we have our groups use the squiggly lines as their starting position. Then, the 2 tanks and 2 split groups will each look clockwise or counterclockwise around the boss until they find their assigned orbs. These orbs will be their responsibility after all of the explosions go off, so they'll need to rotate in such a way into the safe zone to make it easy to reach their orbs in time. Yet another Deep Shadow Nova raid blast to heal through before the boss stands up again. Make sure you move out of melee range to avoid the point blank AoE. Another round of Pitch Bog AoE circles will drop next. This time, the raid will want these puddles relatively accessible, and we assign each player a specific area to drop their puddles in. Next up, the boss will cast 4 Giga Slashes with shadows, and players will need to move to the safe side of each shadow for each 4 attacks, all while being very careful not to accidentally pop any of their puddles. Once all 4 Giga Slashes go off, players can then move to their assigned puddles to spawn their clones and remove their puddles. The boss will then cast VOIDGATE Amplifier, and 8 meteor circles will appear around the platform that each require 2 players to soak. All of these circles must be soaked at the exact same time, and since there are only 8 players, you'll need to use your shadow clones to help you soak. Before the meteor circles explode, the boss will cast SHADOWKEEPER, causing each shadow clone to teleport directly behind their tethered player. All players will need to position themselves in such a way to force their shadow to teleport inside of their assigned meteor circle. They'll then need to be careful to avoid the shadow clones' cleave attack as they position inside of the meteor circles to soak. It is possible to have 2 shadow clones soak 1 meteor, and players can force them all to take the outer meteor circles to avoid the chance of getting cleaved while they take the 4 inner circles. Whatever way you choose to do it, as long as there are 2 bodies inside of each meteor circles, you're golden. As the first meteor circle soak is happening, the boss will begin to cast Shadowy Eruption, which will drop down large AoE circles underneath all players. You can move away to bait these out of the way. Another round of 4 meteor circles will spawn in the center during this time, and the boss will then cast Shackle together. This time, each tank and healer will be forced close to their tethered damage dealer to avoid damage and debuffs. To handle this with the second round of meteor circle soaks, we simply have the tanks and healers position themselves inside assigned meteor circles. Then, once the tethers are out, each damage dealer runs to their tethered tank or healer and stands with them inside of the circle. You'll have 1 more tank buster to cool down and swap for. Another round of Umbral orbs will spawn in the corners while the boss returns down on all 4s. Be sure to use a knockback immunity while you position for your orbs so you don't miss a soak. Another 2 Deep Shadow Nova raid blast to heal through before the boss eventually enrages. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Up next, we'll head into Eden's Promise and Amorphous' Savage. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.